On the 5th of February, an engineer in California flipped a switch on a whitelist. He fired no weapon. He crossed no border. He sat in an office and updated a list of which satellite terminals were allowed to connect and which were not. And 8,000 kilometers away along a front line carved across eastern Ukraine, Russian assault columns simply stopped moving. Not slowed, stopped. This is not the story of a battle. There was no great clash that week, no breakthrough you could trace on a map, no city that changed hands in a morning. This is the story of how a war machine that had ground forward for 18 straight months lost the one thing it needed most. The thing it could not see, could not touch, and could not replace fast enough. This is the story of the silence that came before the retreat, and it begins with a switch. For most of this war, the front line has behaved like a slow tide. It crept, it pushed. It took a village here, a tree line there, a ruined factory after a month of dying for it, and it almost never gave anything back. From the late summer of 2024 onward through the long, brutal autumn and the frozen winter, the direction was always the same. Russia advanced. Ukraine bled to slow it. Analysts argued about the pace, but not the heading. The map moved east inch by costly inch, and the world grew used to that rhythm. It became the background noise of the war. Russia takes Ukraine, holds repeat. Then the rhythm broke. In the 4 weeks between the 21st of April and the 19th of May this year, Russian forces did not gain ground. They lost it. The Institute for the Study of War tracked it, and Russia Matters crunched the numbers. In that window, Russia suffered a net loss of 69 square miles of Ukrainian territory. The previous 4-week period, they had lost just 2, and the bleeding was accelerating week over week. 12 square miles lost in the second week of May, then 29 in the third. The line was not just reversing. It was reversing faster the longer it went. Now let me be honest with you right away because this number can lie to you if you let it. 69 square miles is small. It is about half the size of Las Vegas. Russia still occupies roughly 20% of Ukraine, somewhere near 45,000 square miles of it, an area about the size of the state of Pennsylvania. Nobody is driving anybody back to Moscow. If you came here for a victory parade, this is not that video, and I would rather lose you now than lie to you later. But here is what the number actually means. This was the first time since Ukraine's stunning incursion into Kursk in August 2024 that Russia gave back more than it took. The first net loss in nearly 2 years, and it did not happen because Ukraine suddenly conjured 100 fresh brigades out of nowhere. It happened because the machine that does the advancing developed a very specific kind of blindness. To see why that blindness was fatal, you have to understand how this war is actually fought now, not how it looks in old footage, how it actually works in the spring of 2026. Forget the picture of tanks rolling across open fields. The modern Russian assault is not a charge. It is a conversation. A small group moves forward, often just a handful of men, sometimes on foot, sometimes on motorcycles, because the armor draws too much fire. A drone hovers overhead and watches the ground. A spotter, sometimes kilometers away, reads that drone feed and relays what he sees. Artillery adjusts based on his words. The next group moves based on what the last group learned and survived. Every single meter of advance depends on units talking to each other and to the machines in the sky constantly in real time. The talking is not support for the attack. The talking is the attack. And for a long stretch of this war, that conversation rode on two things that did not belong to the Russian state at all. The first was Starlink. Thousands of satellite terminals, smuggled across borders, bought through middlemen and shell companies, wired into Russian command posts and drone teams. They gave Russian units fast, reliable internet exactly where the Russian military's own networks were thin, overloaded, or jammed. Russia remarkably had no real homegrown equivalent, so it leaned on an American company's hardware to run its war against an American-backed enemy. The second crutch was Telegram. The messaging app where Russian soldiers coordinated movements, shared drone feeds, ran informal supply chains, and even crowdfunded their own equipment because the state would not provide it. Neither tool was built for them. Both became load-bearing. Pull either one and the structure groans. Pull both and it buckles. In February, both went dark within days of each other. Let's start with the switch because the switch came first. In early February, SpaceX, the company behind Starlink, implemented a whitelist system across Ukraine. In plain terms, they built a list of every terminal that was authorized to operate the Ukrainian ones and switched off everything that was not on it. The smuggled Russian terminals along the front lost their connection in a matter of hours. Elon Musk said his company had taken successful steps to prevent what he called the unauthorized use of Starlink by Russia. Ukraine had been compiling that list for weeks, a white list of its own terminals. The point was simple: turn off the Russian ones without taking down Ukraine's own. The effect was not gradual. According to Reuters, an advisor to Ukraine's defense minister described it as a catastrophe for the Russian military. His words were blunt and worth repeating exactly. All command of the troops has collapsed. Assault operations have been stopped in many areas. A Ukrainian officer on the Eastern Front told Reuters that Russian units were having serious communication problems and that almost all of their Starlink connection was gone. And the most telling voices were not Ukrainian at all. They were Russian. The pro-war military bloggers, the men who spend every day cheering this invasion, said the same thing in uglier language. They described chaos in their own units. One wrote that this was all very bad, especially given how crucial communications are at the front. When the propagandists start admitting the problem is real. Now hold that image, because here is the part almost nobody is telling you. And it is the heart of this whole story. The man who flipped that switch had flipped it before, in the opposite direction. In the autumn of 2022, during a Ukrainian counteroffensive near Kherson, Elon Musk reportedly ordered Starlink coverage cut over part of the battlefield. According to Reuters reporting, Ukrainian drones went dark. Surveillance feeds vanished. Artillery that depended on Starlink to aim lost its reference and floundered. A Ukrainian source said the outage directly contributed to the failure of an encirclement operation. 2 years ago, the same technology, the same hand on the same valve hurt Ukraine. It is worth saying plainly that Musk has disputed parts of that account. But the shape of it is not really in question. The connection has always been a weapon. The only question was ever which way it pointed. And here is the turn that makes it sharp. The minister who in 2026 used Starlink to blind the Russians is Mikhailo Fedorov. And in 2022, as Ukraine's digital minister, he was the very man who personally persuaded Musk to turn Starlink on for Ukraine in the first place. The same person, the same satellites, the same switch. It cut against Ukraine in 2022, and it cut against Russia in 2026. And Fedorov was standing at the lever for both, from the man who begged for the signal to the man who took it away from the enemy. That is not a poetic flourish. That is the mechanism laid bare. Whoever controls the connection controls who can see. And for the first time in this war, the connection was turned against Russia by the same Ukrainian who once needed it most. Then came the second blow, and this one Russia did to itself. While the Starlink terminals were going cold, the Kremlin moved against Telegram. In February, Russian authorities began throttling the app. They accused its founder Pavel Durov of failing to comply with Russian law, of refusing to remove banned content, of granting foreign intelligence access to private messages. On the 21st of February, the FSB Russia's own security service posted a public warning that Telegram was unsafe for military personnel. It claimed Ukrainian intelligence could read soldiers' communications through it. The real goal, analysts agree, was to herd Russia's 90 million Telegram users onto a homegrown app called Max, a service controlled by a holding company tied to people close to Vladimir Putin. State control of the message dressed up as security. There was just one problem: the soldiers did not want to move. Telegram was where their war lived. Their drone feeds, their unit chats, their fundraising, the trench maps they passed between positions. Forcing them onto an unfamiliar state-monitored platform in the middle of active operations was like ordering a surgeon to switch hands halfway through the cut. The pro-war bloggers were openly furious. They complained that losing Telegram would hamper their ability to share battlefield information, that it would choke the very fundraising that kept frontline drone teams supplied. The Kremlin had reached for control and grabbed its own throat, so put the two blows side by side. Outside, the Americans cut the satellite link Russia had been leaning on. Inside, the Kremlin throttled the messaging app its own soldiers actually depended on. The eyes went first, then the mouth. A blinded man can still fight. A blinded man who also cannot call for help is just waiting. And this is where the front line answered. Here is the part I want to slow down on, because this is the level most coverage never reaches. They report that comms were disrupted, and they move on. But what does disrupted actually do to an attack? When you cut the connection, you do not merely inconvenience a soldier. You break a specific chain link by link, and each broken link kills men. Start at the top of the chain. The drone still flies. That has not changed. But the feed it sends now has to find another route home, a slower one. Maybe a radio that can be jammed. maybe a relay through 3 other positions, maybe a runner on foot carrying a scrawled grid reference. The spotter who used to pass coordinates in seconds now takes minutes, or cannot pass them at all. The artillery that fired on a live target now fires on a memory at where the enemy was not where the enemy is. The assault group that used to know what waited over the next rise now walks over it blind. And the commander behind them who used to watch the whole picture on a screen is now reading fragments late and guessing at the rest. A Russian platoon does not need to be wiped out to stop advancing. It just needs to lose the ability to coordinate, strip away the real-time picture, and a competent attack degrades into a series of men walking into fire they did not know was there. That is not a metaphor. That is what the slowdown is made of, and the data tracks it precisely. The pace of Russian advance had already been falling before February. In the first 4 months of 2025, Russia gained ground at almost 10 square kilometers a day. In the first 4 months of 2026, that rate had collapsed to under 3. The comms crisis did not begin the slowdown, but it landed at the worst possible moment for Russia on a machine already losing momentum, and it turned a slow grind into an outright reversal. It was the shove that tipped a man already off balance. Now let me give you the second layer, because blindness alone does not explain everything. There is a price tag attached to all of this, and it is staggering. Ukraine's Defense Minister Fedorov laid out a strategy this spring that is almost cold in its clarity. The goal is not to hold every meter of ground. Ukraine cannot hold every meter, and it knows it. The goal is to make every meter Russia takes cost more bodies than Russia can afford to spend. He put a hard number on it. The target is to inflict at least 200 Russian casualties for every single square kilometer Russia advances. Not as a wish, as a benchmark. The level, in his words, at which advancing becomes impossible. And the trend line he revealed is the real story underneath the territory. In October, Russia was losing about 67 men for each square kilometer it took. By January, that had jumped to 165. By February, 244. By March, 254. Each kilometer of dirt was costing Russia almost 4 times as many men in the spring as it had the previous autumn. Ukraine was not just slowing the advance, it was raising the price of it deliberately month after month. And now you can see how the 2 layers fuse into one. When a soldier cannot see, he advances blind. Blind advances die. The comms blackout and the casualty curve are not 2 separate stories sitting next to each other. They are the same story told twice. Cut the connection, and the price of every kilometer climbs because men who cannot coordinate get killed taking ground that men who could coordinate would have taken cheaply. The switch in California and the body count in Donetsk are joined by a single thread. Across the first months of 2026, by Ukraine's own count, Russia lost more than 140,000 men killed and wounded. And underneath that figure sits the structural crack that may matter most of all. For the 5th month running by Ukrainian and Western accounting, Russia was losing soldiers faster than it could recruit replacements. Recruitment had slowed by roughly a 1/5, even as the Kremlin pushed signing bonuses to record highs. The machine was burning fuel faster than it could pour new fuel into the tank, and a machine in that state cannot afford expensive kilometers. It needs cheap ones. The blackout made every kilometer expensive at exactly the moment Russia could least afford the bill. There is a third pressure further from the trench, but pressing on the same nerve. Through the winter and spring, Ukraine ran a relentless campaign of long-range strikes against Russian oil refineries. The strikes hit roughly a 1/5 of Russia's refining capacity over the past year. They forced the sharpest monthly drop in Russian oil production in years. Think about what an armored advance actually runs on. Drones sip fuel from small engines. Tanks and the trucks that feed them drink it by the ton. Squeeze the refineries, and you squeeze the diesel that moves the heavy forces forward. Russia kept its firepower in the sky, but the mechanized muscle on the ground was being starved at the source. Now, I promised you honesty, and honesty cuts both ways. So here's where I slow the story down and tell you exactly what the triumphant version leaves out. Because if I skip this, I am no better than the channels selling you a clean victory. First, almost every casualty figure I just gave you comes from Ukraine or its Western partners. Russia does not publish its losses. Ukraine has every reason to make those numbers look as large as it can. They may well be right. Independent analysts have tracked the same upward trend from separate data, but you should hold them as Ukrainian claims, not as settled fact carved in stone. Second, and this is the one that matters most, look again at that casualty curve. 67, 165, 244, 254. It climbs and climbs and climbs, and then in April it fell to 179. The price of a kilometer dropped. Why? Possibly because Russia simply advanced less, so the ratio shifted underneath. Possibly because the front quieted as the spring mud set in and both sides waited. But the honest reading is this. The line that was supposed to keep rising did not keep rising. The trend is real. The trend is not a straight road upward. And anyone who shows you only the climb and hides the dip in April is selling you a story, not the truth. Third, the weather. March and April in Ukraine bring the Rasputitsa the season when the ground turns to deep, sucking mud and heavy armor cannot move off the roads. Russian advances often slow in those months for reasons that have nothing to do with satellite strategy or casualty math. ISW itself noted that Russia has in past years surged again in May and June as the ground dries out and hardens. Some meaningful share of this spring's reversal may simply be the calendar doing what the calendar always does. The real test does not come in the mud. It comes now as the ground bakes hard. So before we go to the last layer, sit with the uncomfortable version for a moment the way an honest analyst has to. The numbers are partly one-sided. The casualty curve already wobbled once. The mud did some of the work that strategy is taking credit for. A serious person holds all of that in one hand without flinching. And yet, even after you subtract every caveat, something real and stubborn remains. Russia threw its largest aerial effort of the entire war at Ukraine this spring. More than 8,000 drones launched in a single month, the highest monthly total on record decoys and strike drones together. 8,000 machines flung into the sky over a few weeks. And the ground still moved the wrong way for them. You cannot blame mud for that. Drones fly over mud. Drones do not care about the Rasputitsa. The thing all that air power could not fix was the broken conversation on the ground beneath it. The sky was full of Russian machines. The earth underneath was full of Russian soldiers who could not hear each other, and it was the earth that decided where the line went. Which brings us finally to the bet. There are really two clocks running now, and the war this summer comes down to a simple question of which clock runs faster. The first clock is Russia's repair clock. And here I have to give you the point that cheerleaders always skip because leaving it out would make me one of them. Carnegie's analysts said it clearly. Neither Starlink nor Telegram is irreplaceable. Russia is already building backup communications, standing up field networks, improvising workarounds, dragging its soldiers onto the Max app whether they like it or not. Armies adapt. They always adapt. The only real question is how fast. If Russia stitches its nervous system back together before the ground fully dries, then this spring's reversal was a window, not a turning point. And windows close. The second clock is Ukraine's exploitation clock. A surprise only pays out while it is still a surprise. The very moment Russia adapts the advantage of having blinded, it starts to drain away. Kyiv knows this better than anyone. That is exactly why the language coming out of Ukraine this spring was about pressing now, about regaining the initiative now, about liberating territory while the enemy is still fumbling in the dark for a signal. They are not celebrating. They are racing a clock. And there is a quieter signal in the background that tells you Russia knows the bill is coming due. This month, Putin sat down with Xi Jinping for their summit, the 9th since the invasion began. There were warm words. There was no signature on the gas pipeline deal Russia wanted. The deal that would bind China to buy more of the oil and gas Russia can no longer sell freely. The partner Russia leans on is happy to lean back, but not to sign. A great power that has to ask and gets a smile instead of a contract is a great power running short on options. So here is where I put my money, and I will tell you precisely what would prove me wrong. Because a forecast you cannot disprove is just a prayer. I do not believe this is the end of Russia's war. I do not believe Ukraine is about to roll the front back to the borders of 2022. Both armies are too worn, the manpower too thin on both sides. Even Ukraine's own former top commander has called large-scale recapture by force almost impossible right now. That is not the bet. I want to be very clear that it is not the bet. The bet is narrower and, I think, far sturdier. I believe the communications blackout was the single most important reason the front reversed this spring, more than the mud, more than any one local offensive. And I believe the summer will be decided not by who launches more drones, but by which side fixes or exploits the broken conversation on the ground faster. If Russia restores reliable battlefield communications before the earth hardens the advance resumes, and those 69 square miles flow back the other way by autumn, if Ukraine keeps Russia deaf and blind through the drying season, the reversal holds, and it may even deepen. That is the race. Two clocks, one signal between them. And here is how you will know who is winning without waiting for a single headline to tell you. Do not watch the territory maps day to day. They are noisy, they swing on infiltration tactics and gray zones, and they will mislead you. Watch two quieter numbers instead. Watch whether the casualty cost per square kilometer climbs back above 250 the way it did in March, or keeps sliding the way it did in April. And watch whether Russia's net territorial loss turns back into a net gain once the summer ground is dry and the armor can roll again. The price of a kilometer and the direction of the line. Those two figures will tell you which clock won long before anyone stands up to declare it. Because this war stopped being about who fields the bigger army a long time ago. It is about who can still hear, who can still see, and who is shouting into the dark with no one answering. In February, somebody in California flipped a switch, and for one spring the dark belonged to Russia. Whether it stays that way depends on a question we cannot answer yet. How fast can a blinded giant learn to fight by feel armies have done it before? The good ones learn fast. We are about to find out what kind of army this one still is. We will have our answer by the time the ground is dry. Watch those two numbers. They will speak before the headlines do. If this is the kind of breakdown you want the mechanism under the map instead of just the map, then subscribe and stay with it. This is the part almost everyone else skips. The next move in this war is already being decided. Right now in places the cameras are not pointed.